my name is Eva Modrzejewska, and I am an academic scholar from the University of Warsaw. In my research, I focus on rhetoric in the public communication and media literacy. Today, I was invited here because I had a pleasure to translate a bad news game into Polish, of course. And in this webinar, I'm going to talk with Dr. John Roozenbeek from the Cambridge Social Decision Making Lab in the Department of Psychology at the University of Cambridge, the co-creator of online games such as Bad News and Go Viral. Hello, John.
Hello.
Okay, before I start, I would like to remind you that we have here a webinars chat, and you can leave any question or comment you like, and then we'll go back to that and try to answer it. Okay, so a few days ago, I read an opinion about the infodemic. So it is understood as dissemination, especially in social media, of unfounded explanations and theories, fake news and fake science regarding COVID-19. And in the author's opinion, the country is basically defenseless against attacks of misinformation that strike at the heart of public health. That's quite bad news, isn't it?
Terrible news.
Yeah, are we really defenseless?
No, not defenseless, no. But I do agree that we have a significant problem. That's for sure. It is incredibly easy, unfortunately, to come up with some kind of lie, right? Or come up with some kind of story or exaggeration of some kind, and then spread it as far as you can on social media networks, in Facebook groups, on Twitter, whatever. Yeah, that's something that we're trying to figure out, obviously, like how to deal with that kind of thing. But I wouldn't say that we're defenseless, no, for sure. Like thankfully, we can leverage not only things like regulations and laws and stuff like that, which have their own problems usually when it comes to things like censorship and perceived censorship, or algorithms which make mistakes. But thankfully, we can also leverage behavioral science and psychology to improve people's ability to spot fake news.
Okay, so you co-created short online games called Bad News and Go Viral, which is actually a younger sibling of Bad News. The first one has 13 language versions, including Polish, Czech, Greek, and even Esperanto. And Go Viral can be played in French, German, and English, of course. They can be treated as a kind of protection against misinformation. So could you please tell us something about both of them?
Yeah, so I'll explain very briefly sort of the background behind the idea of these games. So both games are very simple in the sense that they don't have a large learning curve, browser games that you can just play in any browser for free. And the idea is that in the game, you take on the role of a fake news creator, almost.
Tycoon.
Right, yeah, it sounds dangerous, but it really isn't. And the idea behind it is throughout the course of the game, you learn how different manipulation or fake news techniques work. So by taking on the role of a fake news creator, by walking a mile in their shoes, if you will, you are learning their tactics, and that our research also shows it helps you improve spotting those tactics in social media content or news headlines when you are exposed to them after playing the game.
So before I ask you about those techniques, maybe it is worth asking. Actually, you put a player in the role of a bad guy. So don't you think it's a bit unethical?
Oh yeah, totally unethical, of course.
So how you deal with that?
No, so what we try to do with this is a bit like ruining the magician's trick, right? So we try with humor and like by making entertaining games, basically, we try to expose what fake news creators are doing. And we're not really revealing any secrets, right? It's not like the secret KGB handbook that we got from a library in Moscow somewhere that we are the first to uncover. No, these tactics are very well known, and they're not a secret at all. Really, they are quite simple. For example, using emotional language, right? It's emotionally charged words like horrible, terrible, horrific, and so on. Just using that type of moral outrage in your social media posts already helps them go viral more than if you didn't use those words. Research shows this. So what we're doing is basically training people to pick up on these cues, right? These techniques with this perspective taking exercise. So in that sense, we consider the risk that we are secretly creating an army of fake news creators to be quite low. So yeah, if you really were motivated to start spreading your own fake news, playing this game would teach you nothing new, most likely. But also you need things like money and political motivation of some kind to start spreading your own fake news. And the games that we make offer neither of these two things. It doesn't explain how to make money using fake news, and it doesn't explain anything about, politics, really. It's all politically neutral in the sense that anyone from any background can play it, regardless of their persuasion, just because we want people to recognize the techniques that are used, which are universal across different types of content, pretty much, regardless of the political ideology behind it.
Okay, so we can say that bad news and go viral are actually learning by doing media literacy tools, right?
That is correct.
Yeah, okay. And you have introduced, they introduced and explained some techniques. One you've mentioned that about this very specific emotional words, but I know that in the background there are some more serious sources of those techniques. So can you name them and say how you pick them up?
Well, what we did basically initially, at least with the bad news game and later for the go viral game as well, is we looked at, we sort of did a survey of different types of manipulation strategies and techniques that we commonly encounter when just browsing through social media or when looking at, different types of fake news content. What we didn't do is make it completely comprehensive in the sense that if you play the game, you will learn about all fake news techniques that exist. That's too much to ask.
And
we also want to make sure that the games are fun, right?
Yeah, and it's changing very fast, isn't it?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. There's that, and it's one thing to be, academically exhaustive, which as an academic you kind of want to do sometimes. You want to give people all of the information that they need, but our priority was to create a game that is fun, that people actually want to play, rather than make an educational tool first and a game second. It was more a game first and then a psychological vaccine, if you will, second. So with regards to the techniques in the bad news game, I already mentioned emotional language, which is also one that appears again in the go viral game because it's such a key element of many different types of content that we see. But also, for example, conspiracy theories, right? Like what are the elements, the components of a conspiracy theory? And how can you pick up on that, right? Because not every conspiracy is wrong. Obviously, there are real conspiracies, but some are, or most are. And how do you know when someone is trying to sell you a conspiracy theory? Well, then you need sort of like to know what elements or components it consists of, so that you at least recognize that it is a conspiracy theory. And then what we don't want to do is tell people this is a conspiracy, don't ever believe it, because that obviously isn't the right thing to do. At least we don't think so. But rather, if you're aware that this is what's happening, that this is how someone might try to manipulate you into believing a conspiracy, then you can do with that information what you want. And what we actually consistently find is, as if people are more aware of what the manipulation techniques that are used on them look like, they become less susceptible to this type of content when they see it.
As I remember, one of the sources for the scenario was the Digital Hydra report. This is a report from NATO, so quite reliable source. But as you already mentioned, the plot isn't very serious as such. However, it is still a scientific-based game. So this is a kind of research tool. Can you say something about that?
Yeah. So the game is grounded in a very relatively old framework from social psychology called inoculation theory, which is the idea of, as I mentioned before, psychological vaccines against manipulation, right? A vaccine against brainwash, if you will. And the idea of a psychological vaccine is just like a regular vaccine, right? A regular vaccine is a weakened version of a virus, let's say, that is injected that prompts the body to create antibodies against the virus, and that protects you from future infection. Same with mental vaccines or psychological vaccines. You introduce a weakened version of a particular misleading argument or a manipulation technique. For example, in the game, it is very much a weakened version of what you would really encounter online because it's more humorous. It doesn't have the same political charge. It doesn't really touch on very sensitive topics. There's no violence and things like that. So it's a weakened version of real fake news that you might encounter in the wild. And by being exposed to it, the idea is that you begin to create your own counter arguments against future attacks, mental antibodies, if you will. And what we then do is, okay, if this works as a psychological inoculation, then that should mean that after people play the game, if they are given or shown, let's say, fake news that's commonly encountered in social media posts, let's say, that they've never seen before, and you ask them how reliable, for example, do you think this post is? And what you should see is that people who play the game find fake news less reliable than a control group that didn't play the game and played Tetris, let's say, right? Because the people who played the game are inoculated or vaccinated against fake news, and therefore they should be more aware of future misinformation and manipulation attacks. And that is basically exactly what we found. So we have, I think, some numbers, 6 or 7 or something like that, papers that we have published, sort of testing this inoculation effect conferred by the Bad News game and other games we created. And it is very robust so far as we can tell. For example, we recently published a paper where we tested, okay, how long do people stay better than the control group at spotting fake news after they played Bad News? And that turns out to be quite long, actually, up to 13 weeks, if you give them regular reminders of what they learned, right? So you play Bad News, and then 2 weeks after, someone reminds you, hey, you remember that you learned about these 6 techniques? Just a very, very brief 5-second reminder. That already is enough, apparently, to reactivate the lessons that people learned while playing the game. So then, like, that memory is retained, and you can still detect that people find fake news significantly less reliable than the control group 13 weeks after they played the game. So that's a really nice, result, actually.
Yeah, sure. So shall I understand that actually 20 minutes of playing can really protect us against misinformation?
Yeah, obviously I'm a scientist, right? So I want to be careful with like the claims that I make. But there does appear to be a measurable effect that you can detect even weeks after people play the game first. Yes.
Okay, so by disseminating bad news and go viral as a media literacy tool in several countries, you're actually running ongoing scientific research right now.
Yes, that is correct.
Okay, so can you elaborate a bit more? How does it look from the player's point of view?
So if you play Go Viral or Bad News, both games, at the beginning of the game asks you, hey, would you mind helping us out with a scientific research? And people can say no, and then they will just continue with the game as they normally would, because we don't want to bother people, right? We don't want to ruin the gameplay experience by forcing them into scientific research, not at all. So it's completely voluntary. And then if people say yes, they are asked a series of questions which basically measure their ability to detect fake news. In the case of Go Viral, fake news about coronavirus. In the case of bad news, about fake news in general. And after you're done playing, you've played through the whole game, the game asks you again, hey, would you mind participating in the follow-up and answer a few more questions? And then we ask people a few more questions, and our idea is basically, in this particular research design, do we find that people find fake news less reliable or something like that after they played through the game? And yeah, that's one of the ways in which we collect data, but we also do randomized control trials where we have a treatment group which plays the game and then a control group which plays a completely different game, right? Like let's say Tetris in our case. And then we compare the results between those two groups, because that makes it a lot easier to infer causality, right? Because if a treatment group and a control group answer exactly the same questions, and you find very significant and strong differences between the treatment group and the control group, then you can infer, well, there's very likely some kind of causal effect at play here. I think that's the mailman, by the way.
Yeah, that happens. Okay, so just to finish that part, you have already published some papers, scientific papers in academic journals. And can you say something about the differences between countries? We have probably here the audience from different countries. Maybe they could hear something typical for their country.
So far we've done, well, we've published research on the effectiveness of these fake news games in the English, Polish, Greek, German, and Swedish versions of the bad news game. And there we find basically that the results remain the same in terms of like the size of the learning effect that people display are roughly the same in every country that we measured. Meaning there doesn't seem to be a big difference between countries in terms of how much people improve at spotting fake news. Now, there's some issues with that, of course, because these are people who chose to play the game, right, voluntarily. So that's obviously different than asking someone completely random from Poland or Greece or Sweden, let's say, right, to play the game, and then we measure how well they learn, because then it's not voluntary participation in the game. So there's that issue, but nonetheless. And then we also have recently finished collecting and analyzing the data for a large-scale randomized control trial with the English, French, and German versions of Go Viral, which we're currently writing up and submitting as an academic paper, so I don't want to say too much about it yet. But very, very roughly, we find pretty much the same results across these three versions as well.
Okay, so coming back to the games, who should play the game and why?
Well, I guess as I mentioned before, right, we tried to make a game first and an educational tool second. So it's not just meant for people who are in school who are learning about media literacy or whatever. It really isn't explicitly meant for people who take a media literacy class in high school or who are doing a university course on fake news of some kind. Not, although of course it's also for them, but it's basically for anyone. But we wrote the language of the game in such a way that it's most recognizable, I suppose, for people between, let's say, 15 and 35 approximately. Because we use things like memes and stuff like that, and if you're not used to meme culture a little bit, then it might seem a little bit less familiar. So we're targeting it at sort of at younger people, but not explicitly, of course. We don't want to discourage someone over 65 from playing the game, obviously. It's just that it might be slightly less recognizable because it just uses more sort of modern slang and things like that.
But I think I would really recommend it to the group of 50 plus, because they are very active in social media, and I'm think they are not very aware in general of those techniques. So probably, and they are of course also much more political aware. I mean, at least in Poland, they are more frequent voters. So maybe it would be really nice to use it with not only with teenagers, that's obvious, but also with adults and like 50 plus as well. But
Sure.
maybe it's worth mentioning that Bad News has also its shorter and simple version for children between 7 and 10 years old. And I tested while translating it on my daughter, and she was really very excited about that. The plot is about school. Maybe you could say something a bit more. How did you tailor it to this target group needs?
Yeah, so that was a really interesting project, actually, because, it was a bit of improvisation, I suppose, on my part, because we didn't, the user testing that we did with the junior version of Bad News was basically with the children of people that we know. So what we wanted to do was, we didn't want to tackle like extremely serious topics like climate change or something like that, right? Because someone who's 8 will not care about that. Again, like the idea that we had was, we want to make it a game first and an educational second. So how do you engage someone who's 8 or 10 years old? Well, why don't you let them run the school website, right? So you enter a fictional environment in which the principal of the school or the head teacher of the school asks you to run the school website, and your goal is to become as popular as you can be by spreading fake news about the head teacher, by coming up with all sorts of crazy ideas, and then you see that your school website that you're running, because you make appropriate use of fake news techniques, becomes bigger and bigger and bigger. So that's sort of what inspired that version.
And I think it's really very important topic, especially regarding online schooling. To raise this kind of misinformation awareness among children, because I think we sometimes we are doing a mistake by thinking that these so-called digital natives, that they just naturally gain information and media literacy skills, and in fact it is not like that at all. So could you comment on that?
Yeah, that's correct. A colleague of mine, Thomas Nygren at the University of Uppsala, actually does a lot of research on young people's and school pupils' ability to spot fake news. And one of his conclusions is, well, like, we think that digital natives or young people are better or really good, even maybe, at spotting fake news, but in reality, like, kind of not really. It's not that impressive. So for sure, exactly as you say, it is really important that we think about media literacy or psychological vaccines even in schools and things like that, and not make the assumption that it's going to be all right and it's only a problem for people who aren't used to the internet or didn't grow up with it, as young people today are doing. I completely agree with you.
Okay, you have mentioned, I guess, this term prebunking. We know the term to debunk the fake news, but you are using this new term, which is called prebunking. So can you tell us about this conception?
Yeah, I don't want to pretend as if we invented this term. This was invented by a man named John Cook, who is an excellent scholar who lives in the United States, was originally from Australia. And prebunking basically means preemptive debunking. So if you know that misinformation is going to be a problem about a particular topic, for example, the coronavirus vaccine, right? We can already tell, and there's not that much doubt that there's going to be a massive issue once the vaccinations start, which is hopefully very soon, because there are going to be people who are going to get side effects from this vaccine, not many, but there will be some because every vaccine has side effects. It's unavoidable, just like any medicine does. And what is definitely going to happen is people are going to magnify the isolated cases of side effects. And the internet will be most likely awash with stories of people who got whatever, some kind of illness or a cough, I don't know, or something. And it's going to be because of the vaccine, and where people will say this, and that will be used to reduce confidence in vaccinations. So we already know that this is going to happen, or we can predict it with reasonable certainty. So prebunking means, okay, let's already start now, right? Let's already start fighting the myths that we know are going to arise. We don't know exactly what they're going to look like. We don't know exactly what the individual instances of misinformation are going to be, but we know approximately what they will look like. So what we try to do with prebunking is preemptively make people aware that these attacks are coming and what they will look like, so that they will have more resistance against it once they do see, content, in this case, about vaccines, the coronavirus vaccine.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks. I introduced you as a co-creator of the game. So there is a cooperation between the co-creators, and could you name them and say about how did you cope from the stage of idea to the phase of the final product?
Yeah. So the organization mainly that is behind the game and hosts the website and so on is called DROG, which is a Dutch organization. And if you're more interested in knowing what they're about, I would recommend going to www.aboutbadnews.com, which is their website. And then there's also the design agency, which developed the game's backend, but also the visuals and the graphic design, and also had a lot of input in terms of the content, which is Gusmanson Design. So Gusmanson.nl. They're great people, and we work with them a lot. And then there's the people at my lab. Sander van der Linden is the professor, the head of the lab, who came with social decision-making lab, and then PhD student Melissa Basol, who this is a whole sort of conglomerate of people who worked on some of the conceptualizations and sort of wrote the content and made sure that it was all academically valid, et cetera, et cetera. And then obviously there's also, you of course, Eva, and then other translators as well, who've had a lot of input in terms of the contextualization and the translation of these games, because you cannot directly translate a sentence into another language and expect it to work in exactly the same way. Same with topics, right? Some topics are simply more salient than others in some countries than others. So there's so many people involved and too many to mention for sure, or to do it justice at least. But just to very briefly answer your question, the initial seed funding for this game came from the Dutch Journalism Stimulus Fund in 2007. And this was basically just a little bit of money to get the idea of a fake news game off the ground. This was mainly DROG in the Netherlands that was working on this. And then when I got involved, this was early 2018, really. There was the Dutch version of what is now the Bad News game. And then my work was sort of translating it to English, but also making sure that it really makes, it can be used as sort of an academic research tool in a sense. So my task kind of was combining insights from, social psychology and media studies, and also game design to kind of create the game as it is today. But that obviously, I feel like I'm taking too much credit already, so I don't really want to do that. That isn't entirely fair, but there was a large number of people involved in the creation, and I'm actually really impressed that it went as well as it did, with so many different people and so many different ideas.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we've got probably some educators among us. So could you share some good practices, how to arrange the game during the lesson or a workshop? Any good advices, any tips?
Well, if you go to the Bad News website, getbadnews.com, anyways, for the English version, there's a whole document that you can download there that will explain the background, much of which I basically just explained, and also instructions for how to use the game in an educational setting of some kind, right? Whether it be workshop or classroom or media literacy course, it doesn't really matter. So I would highly recommend doing that. But basically, like, the nice thing is that you can play the game on a smartphone, and you can just let people, and like every kid these days has a smartphone anyways, right? Basically every person has one. So it really isn't, it works quite well actually to basically just say, okay, you know what, get your smartphones out, which kids I'm sure love because they're not usually allowed to do that during class. Navigate to this website, play through it, give me your high score. We'll see who wins at the end, right? Which of the students performed best. And then we will discuss the things that we learned in 15, 20 minutes-ish, and discuss the different manipulation techniques and misinformation techniques. And that will already be quite helpful.
Mm-hmm. I think from my experience, and there are in the bad news game, there are 6 scenarios, I guess, and I think you can, every scenario, you get a badge there, a player gets the badge, and I think you can use it to explain not only the technique, but to show also and to talk also about the students' experience regarding this topic. From my experience, they have lots of examples from their own life, just to share and to show how, for example, they were manipulated, or someone, something tried to manipulate them in a real life. I think it's good to join 2 things. One is individual play or play in pairs, and then the discussion afterwards. Okay, so just a final word, just in case there's someone unconvinced among us. What kind of social impact, I have to ask this question, what kind of social impact might be achieved by playing bad news games and go viral?
Well, at the individual level, playing it attentively most likely will improve your ability to spot fake news. So that's nice, right? In terms of societal impact, I think these games are very useful components of a large sort of multi-layered defense system against misinformation. But what I don't want to pretend is that like this game is the end-all be-all solution and just play this game and the problem of fake news is solved. That's too much to ask. It doesn't work like that. Much as though that might be nice, right? It's not realistic to expect that. So obviously, I think these are useful tools for exposing the strategies that people use to mislead other people and make money and achieve political goals and whatever. But obviously, we also need to discuss other things like, okay, well, what is the role of algorithms, the role of regulation and legislation, what is the role of fact-checking, et cetera, to really get to a point where we can have a more comprehensive, as I mentioned, defense system against misinformation. And I think the games are a really good starting point for that discussion as well.
Okay, so thank you for this talk, John. Thank you very much. It was really lovely to see you. And yeah, dear Games for Impact audience, I would like to remind you that there is a website chat, and we will be live in a minute, and I hope John will answer your questions. And well, please visit getbadnews.com website or and goviralgame.com. So getbadnews.com and goviralgame.com. Well, and enjoy the play.
And also, if I'm not wrong, getbadnewspolish.com to see English translation.
Yes, getbadnews.pl.
Getbadnews.pl. My apologies. That is correct. Forget what I said earlier. That was fake news.
PL or your own country, you can put there. Okay, so thank you once again, and well, we'll chat in a minute, but this time it will be live. Hi, I hope we're visible and you hear us. Hello, I'm Eva.
I'm John. As you can see, the meeting was recorded that you saw just now, so I put on a different shirt.
Yes, now we are live, and we have already some comments and questions from you. Some have been answered already, but we are waiting for more. So maybe, John, would you like to answer? We have a question from Steven. How did you decide on your sources to base your bad guy on? What examples could you clearly identify as fake news in order to adopt their tactics?
Right. Well, to be honest, these were not very difficult to find. Like, for example, for the impersonation strategy that you learn about in the first scenario of the game, one good example was some bloke recently, a few years back, who impersonated the billionaire Warren Buffett on Twitter and was basically doling out life advice, like do whatever makes you happy, that kind of stuff. But he wasn't actually Warren Buffett. So this is a relatively, harmless example, of course, but it's definitely like impersonating people online, pretending to be someone you're not, and also like adopting other people's reputation, let's say, was a pretty commonly found thing. So this was an easy one to use for that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Leonardo is asking about the link. I guess he's asking about the link to the games. I hope so. So maybe I will repeat the names. The one is getbadnews.com. If you're searching, if you're looking for English version, and the second game is goviralgame.com. Goviralgame.com. I hope.
And also, if you want to play Eva's Polish version, getbadnews.pl.
Yes, that's right.
Which I encourage if you either speak Polish or want to learn Polish. Both are fine.
Yeah. And as we said, Go Viral Game has 3 versions. It's English, German, and French. But if you visit the main page, you will decide which language version you want to choose. Okay. We have another comment from Clan. Fantastic talk. Thank you very much. I wanted to ask about your opinions of the importance of role-playing, taking on the role of bad news creator in games such as Bad News to teach these skills. Would you consider this an important aspect to your study?
Yeah, it's a really good question, actually. So one of the considerations that went into this is the entertainment value. We thought it was kind of nice to be the only ones making a game where you're not the good guy, right? A bit like Grand Theft Auto or Red Dead Redemption or games like that, where you're, evil basically, or at least not morally good necessarily. And it can be very, very entertaining, right? Because people who play these games understand, oh yeah, this is make believe, this isn't real, but it can be a fun thing to do. That said, we have actually just tested a very different game about vaccinations, as a matter of fact, where we created 2 different perspectives, good guy and bad guy, essentially, to see if there's any difference between them. And the differences in terms of what we find, insofar as how well people are learning to spot misinformation between these conditions, are not large. I don't think they're considerable, but different versions might work for different people. That's for sure. Like some might find one thing more entertaining, others might find something else entertaining.
I like also in the plot of the games that the player can have some ethical concerns. Of course, they are somehow answered by this guy who is leading you, but you cannot exaggerate in any way to win, to be the tycoon of fake news. I think it's a quite good idea. So you have to think of your decisions. You cannot do 100% of fake news. Let's say in a fake news, you have to be quite realistic.
Yeah. As they say, right, like the most effective propaganda and the most effective fake news is that which contains a grain of truth in some way. And one of the very, very big challenges, I think, of media literacy in general, or inoculation and so on, is how do you not only train people to recognize, fake news, but also be critical enough of their media consumption that they are able to tease out what is true and what is false, and by extension are also able to think about, like, well, okay, maybe this does look like an official news source or something like that. Maybe it is the BBC, but it sounds completely fake. And not just use heuristics like, oh, this is mainstream, therefore it's reliable, or this is not mainstream, therefore it's not reliable. Like that's not kind of the heuristic that you want to train, right? So that is a pretty big challenge, I agree, but hopefully this makes some kind of contribution.
Alicia is suggesting to submit the game to the Foundations of Digital Games Conference. Have you heard about that?
I have not. Have you?
No, but well, that's a new challenge, isn't it?
Yeah, right. It sounds like fun. I'll look it up.
Yeah, thank you very much. Okay, so you have prepared bad news. You have prepared go viral. So what next?
So actually, one more project that we are very excited about at the moment is called Harmony Square. And for people who are interested, it's called harmonysquare.game, the website. And this is about election misinformation. So how do you ruin a country? Basically, that's the goal. So you're hired to destroy the peaceful neighborhood of Harmony Square using disinformation or misinformation. And that was really a lot of fun to work on because it's basically an update of bad news in many ways. Meaning the graphics are a bit better. The gameplay is a bit more smooth. It's a bit shorter. It works really well in terms of like the scientific, background and all that. So people who are interested in that, please email me or go to the website. It contains a lot of information. And Harmony Square game. Yeah.
Is it also a one-player game, or do you interact with somebody?
It's similar to Bad News in that sense, although it's a bit more streamlined, I would say. But another really cool thing would be to build some kind of multiplayer version, right? That's actually replayable, that you can play online against your friends, let's say, and you can have like a high score and you can become really good at it. You can learn the different tactics, strategies, etc. That would be fun, but that will take a while to develop for sure.
Is the plot general? I mean, does it fit to one election system or to any election system? It's just about the elections.
So it's about political polarization, and the way we wanted to address how online, like social media, for example, but also disinformation campaigns can fuel political polarization in such a way that it's A, entertaining, and B, not in itself polarizing or politically partisan in some way. So that's why we came up with the fictional neighborhood of Harmony Square, which is completely obsessed with democracy but doesn't really exist. So in that sense, it's very universal, and it addresses these themes of how to polarize different groups in society, how to pull them apart in some way through this lens, as it were, which was quite an exciting thing to be working on, to be honest.
Okay, it sounds really exciting. So I hope I will play it soon, because I'm really very interested in election subject and in civic literacy as well. So I hope it will be also translated in many languages. Do you
Hopefully.
have such plans?
That we do have them. Yes, they're in development at the moment.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, we have.
Oh, one more question.
I don't know. One more question. You mentioned that this psychological inoculation can be used to train people's mind to recognize fake news. But do you think that real-life bad actors, such as governments, could use these same strategies to indoctrinate? Tricky one.
In theory, you can use inoculation to do anything, just like you can use nuclear power, right? Nuclear fission to create a bomb or a power plant. Not that I'm comparing inoculation theory to nukes, of course. That's not the point, but you get the point, right? Like it seems to be a pretty powerful thing within like that sort of available to work on in terms of human behavior and human psychology. So that means that in principle anyone can do it, sure, but at the same time, as I hope I was clear about during my presentation also, like you shouldn't think of these things as like brainwashing or anything like that. It's not like you're not doing persuasion per se. You're not engaging in well, like you're not trying to create a new person like a Homo Sovieticus as they had before, right back in the Soviet Union, where you're trying to brainwash your population into obedience essentially, and also like enthusiastic compliance with a particular political system. Like that, you can do that, you can try, but it only works to a certain extent. Right? Like human brains are not like that wired to obey all the time. So in principle, sure, you can use any psychological insight to do anything you want, really, if you're so inclined. That said, we are using it to do, hopefully good things. And yeah, that's all we can do.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you guys for your questions and your comments. And well, we are available. You can find us in internet. John is at the University of Cambridge. I'm at the University of Warsaw. So, well, see you maybe next time face to face. Who knows? Thank you very much for your presentation and for your work as well.
Thank you, and thanks everyone for joining, and thanks Eva as well for putting this whole thing together. And also thanks to Camila and Jakob, obviously, for their work. Don't want to forget about them either.